Hello, I'm Murray Thompson. I'm a lecturer in the Faculty of Science, and in this video I'd like to talk to you about the difference between primary scientific literature and secondary scientific literature. Now, why is this important? Well, you need to know the difference between these two forms of scientific paper to write your own scientific manuscripts. At the moment, or very soon, you might be writing scientific manuscripts as your assignment for a unit of study or in several units of study. But in a couple of years, you might be writing scientific manuscripts to submit and publish them in international scientific journals. And of course, being able to produce good quality scientific manuscripts and then get them published is going to be really very helpful in your career. Now, as an illustration, I have in this hand, I'll just check and make sure, yes, this is a primary scientific paper and this is a secondary scientific paper. You probably can't see the difference between them at this point and at this distance, so let's have a closer look at them and look for the identifying features of each one. So here is the primary paper. Now, a primary paper mainly reports new scientific findings, usually the results of research. Let's have a look at the top of the page. Here's the top of the primary paper. In this case, it's just an example, reproductive traits of dusky rattlesnakes, Crotalus caesariatus in central Mexico, and here we've got the authors down here. Here we've got the abstract, and in this one, the abstract is also given in Spanish. That's not always the case. Quite often you won't have any other language of abstract apart from English. Now, moving down here, we have the introduction to the primary paper. Quite often it'll have the words introduction there as a heading, but in some cases, like this one, it just launches straight into it without saying that this is the introduction at all. And in this introduction in a primary paper, we see background literature, the results, for example, of other primary papers that have led to the investigation that the authors are presenting in this instance. Now, this can have broad range theories and issues in science. For example, here, reproduction is considered an important life history trait as one of the main components of individual fitness. And then, of course, it gives the reference to the paper that idea has been expressed in. As well as general ideas, sometimes we have very, very specific results from previous primary papers discussed in the introduction. For example, here, some species have been reported to produce litters yearly during high resource years. And again, the references are given from where those results were taken. And so the authors have actually, for example, in this case, they've read the paper by Setzer et al. 2010, and they've extracted that information and thought about it and written it down in the introduction in their own words. Now, as we turn over to the next page in this paper, here's one feature that really gives it away as a primary paper, the materials and methods. Now, the materials and methods explain how the experiments that are being reported in this primary paper were done. And of course, after the materials and methods, the authors go through their results, and you can see a results section there. So if you see a scientific paper that has materials and methods, as well as a results section, and then later on they discuss their results in light of other literature. Let's see if we can find the discussion page. Here we are. And so up here you can see the discussion section. So, therefore, a primary paper has an abstract, an introduction, materials and methods, results, and discussion. This paper is a secondary scientific paper. And that is because it doesn't report any new results itself. What it does is it gathers a lot of information from other papers, quite often primary papers, and condenses those so that the reader can gather a lot of information very, very quickly. Quite often at the top, just underneath the title, it'll quite often say very overtly review, meaning this is a review article, and a review article is a secondary form of scientific paper. Or sometimes you'll see it in the actual text where it'll say, in this review, just down here for example, I'll just zoom in on that a little bit. In this review, and whenever you see those words in this review, you know this has to be a review article and therefore a secondary scientific paper. You're getting, in other words, a second-hand description of primary papers. Now you'll notice too, as you go through, there might be an introduction, that's in common with a primary paper, but very soon you will see titles that describe the section and the kind of literature that they're going through. This one, for example, is on the evolution of mammalian pregnancy and the origin of the decidual stromal cell, just for an example. And later on in the review article, you'll see different headings. Example down here, let's zoom in on this, the structure and evolution of the marsupial endometrium. Endometrium is the lining of the uterus. Now, what should you use the secondary paper for? Secondary paper is great to read and get an overview of the actual literature background. Great to get ideas about a lot of papers in one go. When we look in the reference section of a secondary review article, you'll quite often see that there is many more references than in a primary paper, sometimes up to 100. What you shouldn't do is take text from a secondary paper, say this piece of text, big chunk of it, and you shouldn't paraphrase all of that and put that into your own assignments. That is actually plagiarism, because you haven't gone and read these articles, such as Young et al. 2011, and formed your own opinion and narrative about them. You're simply actually just copying the work of Wagner et al., and you bypassed all of that hard work. So, take-home message here, do not paraphrase, review secondary articles to use in your assignments. What you can do, however, if you are reading a secondary literature review and you see a description of a primary paper's finding that you think looks very interesting, what you do then is look that paper up in the reference section, get the details, then actually read that primary paper yourself, form your own opinion or your own description of its major finding, and put that into your introduction. That's good writing. And here we've come back to the primary paper just to have a look at one exception. And that is, of course, in the primary paper, there is an introduction section which describes papers that have come before this one. And so this part of a primary research paper is actually secondary literature. It describes the work of others. So just as you wouldn't paraphrase from a review secondary article, you wouldn't paraphrase from the introduction of a primary paper. One great way to write your introduction for your scientific manuscript, though, is to find the major point, the major result that the authors of this paper discovered, and you might want to just write it up there on the top in your own words. For example, these people may have found no correlation between the litter size of these snakes and the actual size of the mother. And you just write that in your own words up on the top there of the paper. And you might get 15 or so papers that are relevant to the research paper that you're writing, and then simply you look for the date on each paper and you arrange your papers in chronological order, and then you use your major points that you've noted down to write your introduction. Give it a shot. It's a great way of easily and efficiently and accurately, and very importantly, originally, writing your own introductory articles. One little piece of advice I'd like to give you is, of course, chat to the academic staff here in the units of study that you're studying in, and get as much feedback on the process of writing scientific manuscripts as you can. One thing you might want to ask your academic staff member is if you can get feedback on an assignment that's based on a scientific manuscript before you hand it in. So in other words, take in your draft so far, what you've done so far, and see if you can get some tips to increase the quality of that. Hopefully that process will result in better marks for you, but it also will result in an increased capability that you have to write what is the end product of science. This is where science comes out into the public arena. Thanks for listening. All the best for now.